Hello everyone, and welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is The Carver by Neighbor 7621. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. And if you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe and become a resident of Hill Street and let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. Part 1. Wood. He stood there gazing at the two pillars. These were to be the sources of his masterpieces, his gift to the universe. They would be a representation of the beauty of the life it had spawned amongst the stars. He knew from the beginning that he would have to hide the statues away, for he had been shunned from the world of man before. They could not grasp his art, and those who had attempted to comprehend them often went mad. They were to remain hidden from them, for they were not for mortal eyes. This was a gift, after all. He approached the first of the pillars. It was made of strange wood. He had stumbled upon the misshapen tree that birthed it after his banishment from the heavens. It was a magnificent tree that grew past the clouds and bore red fruit that was so delightful your worries and fears melted away. It had taken many months to find the tree when he decided to create a sculpture from it, but he knew no other material would do. As he stared at this monolithic block, feeling its glorious texture, he reached beneath his tattered and grayed cloak, pulling a curved blade from its sheath. He glanced down at the blade and inspected it briefly, as he wished to return his vision to the pillar of wood. He carved. He thrusted his blade onto the block and pulled it along the edge, peeling away silver of wood. As he did so, a horrid piercing sound rang through his ears, vibrating his skull as though it spawned from his brain itself. He pushed deeper and deeper, the ringing shaking to his core, sculpting it, molding it to form his vision. The sound persisted endlessly, and yet he carved. Slowly the strange wooden block began to form to the artist's will. He twisted splinters together, molded the splints, and hollowed the rings. His cuts had finally shown a result. Limbs were forming, the face taking shape, and its robed body outlined magnificently. He had to stop at that point. The sharp ring had ruptured his ears, and he could no longer take the pain. He looked around for something to plug his ears and stop the bleeding, but found little to no solutions. Finally, he fetched 2 small chips of the block and stuffed them into his ears, returning to his position at the wooden sculpture to continue. He carved. After countless hours, perhaps days of work, the statue was complete. He stepped back to admire his work and marvel at its detail. It was perfect in every way. The dimensions, the precisions of his cuts, how the material reflected the light of his torch. It was a shepherd and his flock. He was guiding them to a better land so that they may flourish. The carver had never put so much detail into his work, never been so meticulous. He felt a sense of pride he had never felt before. Part 2. Stone. The carver stood before the second pillar. This one was made of blackened stone, of which the material was unfamiliar to him. He had stumbled upon it shortly after he had found the tree in a cave hidden from time. He hadn't dared try to move the vast block, so it was that cave he decided to be his workshop. He examined the source closely, as it appeared to be vaguely similar to obsidian. However, the closer one looked, the color was less black and more scarlet. It was a faint sense of color, as though it wanted its sight to be hidden from prying eyes. He slid his hand across the surface and tapped it with his knife. He had decided to not plan this sculpture, but merely allow his blade to guide its creation. And so, he carved. He began hacking and chiseling away at the block. The screeching of the blade on stone was maddening and vastly more horrific than that of the wooden block. With each scrape, it felt as though the terrible sound would drive the wooden plugs deeper into his ear canals, as if they grew in a twisted malice inward towards his skull. He pushed through as far as his body allowed him, until finally he could take the pain no more. He collapsed to the ground, his hands being pierced by the demonic chips from the hateful stone. He reached to the wooden plug of his right ear, attempting to remove it, yet for all his desire to have them out, it refused to move. He began to try the left plug, yet it would not budge in the slightest. So he grabbed his blade and did the only thing he could. He carved. He held his blade as close to the base of his ear and swiftly moved its edge around it to not cut the wooden pieces. Quickly he moved to the next ear, repeating the same process. Then firmly grasped the edges of them, bracing himself for the pain to come. He yanked them simultaneously, and as the remaining unsevered flesh tore from their connecting tissues, he could feel the wooden plugs tug at the base, as though they had sprouted roots. The carver screamed out in agony as his ears separated. He held out the bloody pieces of cartilage and could see the wooden plugs as clear as day. They had indeed grown roots and were larger than when he initially placed them in. What had caused this? Was it perhaps invoked by the sounds of the stone being cut? He watched as the blood pooled between the cracks in his fingers, dripping slowly to the ground, and there was no sound. He quickly grabbed his blade and struck the stone. Again, there was no sound. He shakingly got to his feet, bracing himself against the half-carved pillar. He carved. He continued his work vigorously, his blade guiding itself as though it was guided by the forces beyond comprehension. The shavings and the chips of the stone crunching beneath his feet, splintering into his flesh. Hours passed, perhaps days, and yet the carver was so driven to complete his statue, he could vaguely understand that time had passed at all. With one final stroke of his blade, he knew it was finished. Stumbling backwards from exhaustion and blood loss, he looked upon his creation and screeched in terror. What monstrosity was this? The horrible sight made him wish to gouge his eyes from their sockets. His hand gripped the earless sides of his head. His nails dug into his flesh. He quickly turned away as to save his sanity, As he did so, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of the statue of the wooden shepherd. The sound of the stone had warped it, twisted it beyond any means of repair. It now mirrored the terrifying, ominous evil as that of the stone figure. Now both horrors were gazing upon him. The last of his sanity and will snapped. Screaming, he clawed at his face, gouging out his eyes, and as his sight faded, he began laughing out of fear. Part 3. Silence. The Carver sat there, weeping as the blood poured from what remained of his eyes. His maniacal chuckling subsided from his body. As he stared into the void, he now saw. Though his eyes were gone, he could still see vividly those horrific images of stone and wood. He was grateful he had hidden a way to create them, for surely they would drive any sane person over the edge. He stared at the creations and could feel the putrid hate filling every fiber of his being. These couldn't be his masterpieces. Then suddenly he caught a glimpse of something on the edge of the cave. How he still could see without his eyes, he knew not. But as though driven by the same force that drove his blade, he crawled steadily towards the shadowed wall. As he got closer, he could feel a breath of wind coming from it, as though it led to the exit. He dug his hands along the wall until he felt a small stone wedged between others. Something in his mind told him to pull it, and as he glanced back at the hateful pillars, he gripped the stone and removed it from its placement. Suddenly the wall crumbled to the ground, falling backwards away from the Carver. Once the obstruction had settled, the Carver looked upon the new room and saw it. The monumentous new room held within it a second blackened stone, but this one was half the size of the former, though this one was cracked through and broken by a glorious tree that had sprouted through it. This was the same type of tree that the first wooden pillar had been wrought from. That horrid, yellowed figure seemed to laugh as the Carver began approaching the tree. He turned to look back at his twisted shepherd, and its now yellow face appeared to grin menacingly at him. Turning to face the stone statue, whose hidden shade of scarlet now shone its wrathful glow to all who could look upon it, almost beckoning him to push forward. He turned back to the tree encased in stone, and as he did, a wicked smile engorged his face. He swiftly moved towards it, almost gliding over the rocks in his path. With his blade in hand, he knew what must be done. He carved. His blade dug into the tree, struck the stone. He hacked and hacked as their screeches merged to form a horrific sound. It could barely be called sound at all. The noise struck the Carver through to the core, twisting his mind, corrupting his body, and contorting that evil grin of his to reflect the terrors he had birthed into this world. He continued to hack and slash away at the final piece, his wrenched grin widening with every cut. After all, when one is creating a true work of art, what is there to do but smile? He pushed his body, his brain flooded with the ecstasy of creation, twisting the wood, breaking away stone, slowly revealing the final product. he carved. As his tools scraped against the horrendous materials, things began to change and alter. Everything in the cave was not as it seemed, as though the gaze of the two statues in the first room warped the reality that the carver had known. As he carved, the material changed, as did the carver. Wu turned to flesh, rotten and putrid. Stone turned to bone, ancient as time. The carver discarded his blade and began to sculpt in a more animalistic fashion, ripping the flesh, breaking the bone, and consuming all that separated from his masterpiece. The more he consumed, the more the wrench sound rang true, morphing from the original sound of a piercing shriek to screams of tortured souls, agonizing in tune. Yet they seem off from typical screams of terror, although their pain was easily understood by the carver. They seemed orgasmic in tone, as if being devoured by the mad artist. However painful it was, brought them joy. It consumed, it smiles, it carves. As it took its final bite, tearing the final piece of flesh from bone, he staggered back to the entrance of the room. The yellowed shepherd and the scarlet demon looked down on the carver, their influencing and menacing faces smiling upon it. The carver looked back at them for approval, realizing they were unfinished. Quickly it raced to its pack and pulled from it 2 golden crowns. One after the other, it scaled the statue and placed the crowns on their heads, anointing them as kings above gods. Suddenly it screamed in horror, not for the terrors before him, but for the realization that its glorious creation was uncrowned. It stepped into the room that housed the eldritch horror and grabbed his blade from the ground. It held it to its own flesh and carved. It smiles, it screams, silence. It fashioned a crown from its flesh. It scaled the magnificent horror and placed upon its head. Falling to the ground, it knew its work was done. 3 kings to rule the universe, to terrorize man, to tear sanity from their minds and reveal the truth of madness. 3 kings, a king in yellow, a king of scarlet, a king unseen.